Welcome, dear friend. Tonight, let us journey together into the gentle world of Zen wisdom. As you settle in and prepare for rest, allow these ancient stories to wash over you, soothing your mind, calming your heart, and guiding you toward deep inner peace. With each tale, may you find comfort, clarity, and a quiet space within where healing and tranquility naturally arise. Let's begin this peaceful night together. The Master who ate his own words. Master Kenji lived in a small temple nestled between two mountains where morning mist moved through bamboo groves. Unlike other masters who preserved their teachings in scrolls or passed them down through chanted verses, Kenji had developed a peculiar habit that puzzled even the most devoted students. Every morning, after delivering his daily teaching, Master Kenji would take out a small piece of rice paper, write down exactly what he had just spoken, and then methodically eat the paper, chewing slowly and thoughtfully as if savoring the finest delicacy. The ritual never varied. Words spoken aloud would be transcribed with careful brushstrokes, folded precisely and consumed entirely without ceremony or explanation. Young monk Taro arrived at the temple on an autumn day when maple leaves painted the mountainside crimson. He watched in bewilderment as Master Kenji concluded his morning discourse on impermanence by writing his final words on rice paper, folding it carefully and consuming it entirely. The master's face showed neither satisfaction nor distaste, merely the same peaceful expression he wore during meditation. Taro observed this ritual religiously over the following weeks. Whether Kenji spoke about compassion, emptiness, the nature of suffering, or the illusion of the self, each teaching ended the same way: paperbrush, ink consumption. The other monks had grown accustomed to this practice, treating it as natural as breathing, but Taro remained fascinated and increasingly confused by its purpose and meaning. The young monk began to understand that this was not mere eccentricity, but something fundamental to Kenji's approach to teaching. Other masters in distant temples would spend hours elaborating on single concepts, building complex philosophical frameworks that students could memorize and debate. Kenji's method was entirely different. His teachings were simple, direct, and apparently disposable. One morning, Master Kenji spoke about the danger of attachment to concepts and ideas. His words carried the weight of decades of practice, yet he delivered them as casually as commenting on the weather. When he finished speaking, Taro could no longer contain his curiosity and interrupted as the master prepared his usual ritual. Kenji paused the paper halfway to his mouth and asked Taro to show him where yesterday's teaching resided. Through a series of gentle questions about memory, mind, and location, Kenji demonstrated that if words live in memory, memory exists in mind, and mind cannot be found anywhere specific, then the teachings themselves have no fixed location. The logic was both simple and profound, leaving Taro more confused than before. The master chewed the paper contentedly while Taro struggled with this paradox. How could something so important be treated so casually? How could wisdom be consumed like food and simply disappear? The questions multiplied in Taro's mind, but Kenji offered no further explanation, returning to his daily tasks as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Weeks turned to months, and Taro's frustration grew alongside his fascination. He began writing down Kenji's teachings in secret, creating a hidden collection of the master's wisdom. He told himself this was for future students, for preservation of knowledge, for the good of the Dharma. Each night, by candlelight, He would transcribe what he remembered from the day's teaching, building what he believed would become a valuable repository of spiritual insight. The secret project became an obsession. Taro would review his notes constantly, memorizing phrases and analyzing their deeper meanings. He cross-referenced teachings looking for patterns and contradictions. He organized them by theme and date, creating what he imagined was a comprehensive guide to Kenji's wisdom. The collection grew thicker each week, hidden carefully beneath his sleeping mat. One day, Kenji discovered Taro's secret scrolls during a routine cleaning of the dormitory. The master examined the carefully transcribed teachings without anger or surprise, simply noting how Taro had been collecting words like a squirrel gathering nuts for winter. The metaphor was apt. Taro had indeed been hoarding wisdom against some imagined future famine of understanding. When confronted with his cache of preserved teachings, Taro admitted to studying them daily, reflecting on their meaning and seeking deeper insight. However, when asked to demonstrate how yesterday's teaching on non-attachment had changed him, Taro realized with growing horror that, despite memorizing every syllable, his attachment to his own cleverness and collection had only grown stronger. The teachings had become trophies rather than transformations. Kenji nodded, knowingly, explaining that words preserved become words worship. When wisdom is hoarded like grain in a storehouse, it becomes stale bread that nourishes nothing. The act of preservation itself becomes a barrier to understanding, creating distance between the student and the living truth the words were meant to convey. That morning's teaching was about the futility of seeking truth outside oneself. Kenji spoke about how seekers often mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself, becoming so focused on directions that they never look up to see their destination. As always, he wrote these words on rice paper, but instead of eating them immediately, he handed the paper to Taro and commanded him to eat it. Taro stared at the inked rice paper, uncertain and afraid. The idea seemed sacrilegious, like destroying something sacred. The words represented wisdom, insight, truth itself. How could he simply consume them like ordinary food? Yet Kenji's instruction was clear, and his expectation evident. Reluctantly, Taro placed the paper in his mouth. The ink tasted bitter and metallic while the rice paper dissolved on his tongue like communion wafer. As he swallowed, something fundamental shifted inside him. The words didn't remain in his memory as concepts to be analyzed, categorized, or debated. Instead, they seemed to dissolve into his very being, becoming part of his cellular understanding rather than his intellectual knowledge. The transformation was immediate and profound. Taro felt less clever, but somehow more understanding, less knowledgeable, but more wise. The constant chatter of analysis and interpretation that had filled his mind quieted, replaced by a deeper, wordless comprehension that needed no explanation or justification. From that day forward, Taro's approach to learning changed completely. He stopped taking secret notes and began participating more fully in each moment of teaching. Instead of trying to capture and preserve wisdom, he learned to receive it, digest it, and let it transform him naturally. The pile of scrolls beneath his mat remained untouched, eventually becoming home to mice who appreciated the paper more than Taro had appreciated the words written on it. Months passed, and Taro's understanding deepened in ways that surprised him. Without the burden of constantly trying to remember, categorize, and analyze every teaching, he found himself more present and receptive. The temple, once a place where he felt pressured to accumulate spiritual knowledge, became a sanctuary where living truth could unfold naturally. The temple's daily rhythm reflected this organic approach to wisdom. Each morning brought new teachings that were offered freely and consumed completely. Nothing was hoarded for tomorrow, nothing was preserved for posterity. Like manna in the desert, spiritual insight was provided fresh each day and could not be stored without spoiling. Taro often found himself walking along the riverbank behind the temple, watching the water flow endlessly, never the same, yet always the same. This constant change mirrored the teachings of impermanence that Kenji had shared. The river did not cling to its form, nor did it resist the obstacles in its path. It moved with grace and power, adapting and flowing, embodying the essence of Zen without effort or self-consciousness. In moments of doubt or confusion, Taro would recall the image of Kenji eating his words, a strange yet profound act that challenged every assumption about knowledge, wisdom, and spiritual authority. It was a lesson in humility, a reminder that true understanding is not a trophy to be displayed, but a living force to be integrated and expressed through one's entire being. The other monks, inspired by Taro's visible transformation, began to question their own relationship with teachings and concepts. The temple's atmosphere gradually shifted from one of rigid adherence to doctrine to one of open exploration and heartfelt practice. Discussions that once centered on memorization and philosophical debate gave way to shared silence and collaborative work in the gardens. Kenji's teachings, though often paradoxical and sometimes seemingly nonsensical, were deeply practical in their effect. He emphasized the importance of complete presence, encouraging his students to engage fully with each moment, whether in meditation, manual labor, or simple rest. The act of eating his words was a daily ritual that embodied this principle, a physical manifestation of the need to internalize and embody wisdom, rather than merely accumulate information about it. As years passed, Taro grew into a teacher himself, carrying forward the legacy of Master Kenji in his own unique way. He shared the story of the master who ate his own words with new generations of seekers, not as a curious anecdote, but as a profound invitation to experience the teachings directly rather than analyzing them from a safe intellectual distance. The temple remained a place of quiet refuge where seekers from distant lands came to learn and practice. The story of Kenji's unusual habit spread beyond the mountains, inspiring many to reconsider their relationship with knowledge, authority, and the nature of true understanding. Some dismissed it as mere eccentricity, while others recognized it as pointing towards something essential about the spiritual path. In the end, the story was not really about the physical act of eating paper, but about the transformation that occurs when one lets go of attachment to words, concepts, and the illusion of spiritual accumulation. It was a call to live authentically, to embrace the impermanent nature of all phenomena, and to find wisdom not in external teachings, but within the depths of one's own direct experience. Master Kenji's legacy was a testament to the power of simplicity and the profound truth that sometimes the most meaningful lessons are those that cannot be spoken, written, or preserved, but must be lived completely in each unfolding moment of existence. The monk who forgot his face. Brother Satoshi had been meditating in the mountain monastery for 37 years when he encountered the most peculiar morning of his life. He awoke, as he always did, with the first bell at dawn, rose from his simple mat, and walked to the small mirror hanging beside the wash basin to begin his morning ablutions. The face staring back at him was completely unfamiliar. The features were human, certainly with 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth arranged in the conventional manner. Yet Satoshi felt no recognition, no spark of familiarity, no sense that this reflection belonged to him. He touched his cheek experimentally, watching the stranger in the mirror do the same. The movement was synchronized perfectly, but the disconnect remained absolute. It was as if he were watching someone else's reflection while living inside their body. Satoshi had experienced many strange phenomena during his decades of intensive meditation practice. He had witnessed his thoughts dissolve into emptiness, felt his body boundaries disappear during deep samadhi, and experienced states of consciousness that had no names or categories. Yet this was different. This was not a temporary altered state, but something that seemed to have become his new normal reality. He completed his morning routine, mechanically brushing teeth that felt foreign in a mouth that seemed borrowed, washing a face that belonged to someone else entirely. The other monks noticed nothing unusual during the communal breakfast of rice porridge and pickled vegetables. They greeted him with their customary bows and gentle smiles, clearly recognizing him even though he no longer recognized himself. The meditation hall held 43 monks that morning, each seated in their assigned position on worn cushions that had supported countless hours of practice. Satoshi took his usual place in the 3rd row, 5 spaces from the left wall, a position he had occupied for over 2 decades. Yet even this familiar space felt strange now that he no longer had a clear sense of who was occupying it. During the first sitting period, Satoshi found himself unable to focus on his breath or his traditional meditation object. Instead, he became absorbed in the question of identity and recognition. If he could not recognize his own face, what exactly constituted his sense of self? The reflection in the mirror was clearly connected to his physical movements and sensations, yet it felt completely separate from his internal experience of being. He recalled the Buddhist teaching about the illusion of the self, the doctrine of anatta, or non-self, that he had studied intellectually for decades. The texts spoke of the self as a construction, a collection of physical and mental processes that created the illusion of a permanent, unchanging identity. Yet, this morning's experience was not intellectual understanding, but direct, visceral confrontation with the teaching's reality. The breakfast bell interrupted his contemplation, but the mystery only deepened as he observed other monks throughout the day. Each face was perfectly recognizable to him. He knew Brother Takeshi by his slightly crooked smile, Brother Yamamoto by his deep-set eyes, Brother Fujita by the small scar above his left eyebrow. Yet his own reflection remained a complete stranger, as foreign as if he had never seen it before. During the afternoon work period, Satoshi was assigned to tend the monastery's vegetable garden, a task he had performed countless times over the years. His hands knew exactly how to hold the hoe, how to identify weeds from vegetables, how to judge the moisture content of the soil. Yet these hands looked unfamiliar when he glanced down at them, as if they belonged to someone else who happened to share his knowledge and muscle memory. The philosophical implications began to unfold as Satoshi worked among the rows of daikon radishes and Chinese cabbage. If his identity was not tied to his physical appearance, then what was the foundation of his sense of self? His memories remained intact and clearly his own. His personality, his preferences, his accumulated knowledge and wisdom all felt unchanged. Yet the visual component of self-recognition had vanished completely. Evening meditation brought no relief from the mystery. If anything, the strangeness intensified as Satoshi sat in the darkened hall, aware of his body's position and sensations, but unable to connect these experiences to the unfamiliar face he had seen that morning. The boundary between self and not self, always somewhat fluid during deep meditation, now seemed to have dissolved entirely in this one crucial area. Sleep offered no escape. Satoshi's dreams were filled with mirrors and reflections, each showing him the same stranger's face. He would reach toward the glass in his dreams, trying to touch this unknown person, only to have his hand meet the cold surface, while the reflection remained impossibly separate and unreachable. The condition persisted through the following days and weeks. Each morning brought the same shock of non-recognition, the same encounter with a stranger in the mirror. Yet, gradually, Satoshi began to adapt to this new reality and even to find profound meaning in it. The face in the mirror became less threatening and more mysterious, a daily reminder of the fluid nature of identity and the constructed nature of self-perception. He began to observe how other people's reactions to him remained completely unchanged. The abbot still smiled warmly when they passed in the corridor. The younger monks still approached him for guidance with their meditation practice. The local villagers who visited the monastery still greeted him with the same respectful bows they had offered for decades. Clearly, his identity in the eyes of others was unaffected by his inability to recognize himself. This observation led to deeper contemplation about the nature of identity itself. Satoshi realized that his sense of self had always been partially dependent on external validation and recognition. The familiar face in the mirror had been a daily confirmation of his continuous existence, a visual anchor for his sense of personal history and individual identity. Without this anchor, he was forced to find other foundations for his sense of being. Months passed, and Satoshi's practice deepened in unexpected ways. Without the distraction of self-recognition, he found himself less concerned with personal appearance and more focused on inner states and experiences. The morning encounter with the stranger in the mirror became a daily lesson in non-attachment and the impermanent nature of all phenomena, including his own sense of individual identity. He began to understand that the face he had once recognized as his own had been just another transient phenomenon, no more permanent or essential than any other aspect of his physical or mental experience. The loss of facial recognition had stripped away one layer of ego identification, revealing deeper levels of consciousness that existed independent of physical appearance or self-image. The other monks gradually became aware that something had changed in Satoshi's demeanor and presence, though none could identify exactly what was different. His teachings during the weekly Dharma talks carried a new quality of authority and insight. His answers to students' questions came from a place of direct experience rather than intellectual understanding. His entire presence seemed lighter, less burdened by the weight of self-consciousness and personal identity. One morning, nearly a year after the initial incident, Satoshi approached the mirror with his usual mixture of curiosity and detachment. The stranger's face looked back at him as always, but something fundamental had shifted in his relationship to this daily encounter. Instead of seeking recognition or feeling disturbed by its absence, he simply observed the face with the same compassionate attention he would offer to any other sentient being. In that moment of complete acceptance, a profound realization dawned. The face in the mirror had never truly been his face, just as his body had never truly been his body, and his thoughts had never truly been his thoughts. All phenomena, including his own physical and mental processes, were simply temporary appearances in consciousness arising and passing away without any permanent substance or essential identity. The stranger in the mirror smiled, and Satoshi smiled back, not in recognition, but in appreciation for this daily teacher who had guided him toward deeper understanding of the Buddha's teaching about the illusion of self. The face remained unfamiliar, but familiarity itself had revealed its irrelevance to the deeper truth of being. Years continued to pass, and Satoshi's condition never changed. Each morning brought the same encounter with the unknown face, but this daily mystery had become a source of profound gratitude rather than confusion. He had learned to live without the security of self-recognition, discovering in the process that true security came not from any external confirmation of identity, but from the deeper recognition of consciousness itself. The monastery became known throughout the region for the unusual wisdom of Brother Satoshi, though few visitors understood the source of his insight. Those who came seeking teachings about the nature of self and identity found in him a living embodiment of the Buddha's teaching about non-self, someone who had been freed from one of the most basic forms of ego attachment through the simple inability to recognize his own reflection, the temple that existed. Only on Tuesdays, scholar Hiroshi first heard about the mysterious temple from an elderly tea merchant in the mountain village of Shirakawa. The merchant spoke in hushed tones about a sacred place that could only be found on the second day of the week, vanishing completely during all other times, as if it had never existed at all. The story seemed absurd to Hiroshi, who had spent 15 years studying Buddhist architecture and visiting temples throughout Japan. He prided himself on his rational approach to religious scholarship, carefully documenting the historical development of temple construction and the geographical factors that influenced their placement. A temple that appeared and disappeared according to the calendar violated every principle of logic and physics he held dear. Yet, the merchant's certainty was troubling. The old man possessed detailed knowledge of the temple's layout, describing ornate wooden carvings, specific arrangements of stone lanterns, and the exact positioning of meditation halls that suggested genuine familiarity rather than folklore or imagination. He spoke of morning services conducted by monks whose faces seemed to shimmer like reflections on water, and evening ceremonies where incense smoke formed impossible patterns in the still air. Hiroshi decided to investigate, approaching the matter with the same methodical precision he applied to all his research. He obtained detailed maps of the region, interviewed local villagers about unusual phenomena, and studied historical records for any mention of temples that appeared intermittently. The evidence was contradictory and frustrating. Some villagers claimed to have visited the temple on various Tuesdays throughout their lives, while others insisted no such place existed anywhere in the mountains. On a Monday evening, in late spring, Hiroshi began his ascent into the mountains, following the directions provided by the tea merchant. The path was well marked, initially winding through dense forests of cedar and bamboo that filtered the afternoon sunlight into shifting patterns of green and gold. As he climbed higher, the trail became increasingly obscure, eventually disappearing entirely into rocky terrains that showed no signs of regular human passage. He spent the night camping in a small clearing, checking his compass and maps repeatedly to ensure he was following the correct route. The merchant had been specific about landmarks: a boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, a stream that flowed uphill for exactly 30 paces, a grove of cherry trees that bloomed regardless of season, Hiroshi had found each of these features during his climb, though he could offer no rational explanation for the stream's impossible direction or the cherry blossoms that perfumed the air despite the late spring timing. Tuesday morning arrived with unusual weather patterns that seemed to shift moment by moment. Sunlight would illuminate the forest floor intensely for several minutes, then clouds would appear suddenly to cast everything into deep shadow, only to vanish again without any apparent cause. The air itself felt different, charged with an energy that made Hiroshi's skin tingle and his thoughts scatter in unfamiliar directions. Following the merchant's final instruction, Hiroshi walked directly east from the cherry grove for exactly 200 paces, then turned north and continued until he encountered a natural rock formation that resembled a torii gate. As he approached this stone archway, the air began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement, and gradually, impossibly, a temple complex materialized before his eyes. The building appeared slowly like a photograph developing in chemical solution. First came the outline of the main hall, its roofline emerging from nothingness, with elegant curves that seemed to flow organically from the mountain landscape. Then the supporting structures became visible, smaller meditation halls, living quarters for monks, a bell tower that cast no shadow despite the bright morning sun. Finally, the details filled in intricate wood carvings, stone pathways worn smooth by countless footsteps, gardens where flowers bloomed in impossible combinations of color and season. Hiroshi stood frozen at the entrance, his rational mind struggling to process what his eyes were witnessing. The temple was undeniably real and physical. He could smell incense drifting from the main hall, hear the soft chanting of morning prayers, feel cool air flowing from the shaded corridors between buildings. Yet he had walked through this exact location less than 12 hours earlier and found nothing but empty forest. A monk approached from the main hall, his movements fluid and graceful despite advanced age. His face held the serene expression common to long-time meditators, but his eyes contained depths that seemed to reflect infinite space. Without speaking, he gestured for Hiroshi to follow, leading him through courtyards where morning glory vines climbed walls that had definitely not existed the previous day. The monk guided Hiroshi to a small tea house overlooking a koi pond where orange and white fish swam in patterns that formed constantly changing mandalas. Here the monk finally spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades contemplating the nature of reality and existence. The monk explained that the temple had been built over 300 years ago by a master who understood the conditional nature of all phenomena. Rather than constructing a permanent structure that would slowly decay over centuries, the master had chosen to demonstrate the fundamental Buddhist teaching about impermanence by creating a temple that existed only intermittently, appearing and disappearing according to conditions that most people could not perceive or understand. The specific choice of Tuesday was not arbitrary, but related to complex principles of temporal existence that the master had discovered through deep meditation on the nature of time itself. Each day of the week carried different energetic qualities, and Tuesday possessed the particular combination of conditions necessary for the temple's manifestation. On other days, the same location contained all the potential for the temple's existence, but the actualizing conditions were absent. Hiroshi spent the entire day exploring the temple complex, documenting everything he could observe and experience. The buildings were constructed with traditional Japanese techniques, but incorporated architectural innovations he had never encountered in his scholarly research. wooden joints fitted together without nails or metal fasteners, yet the structures felt perfectly solid and stable. Stone foundations appeared to grow directly from the mountain bedrock, as if they had been carved from single enormous rocks rather than assembled from smaller pieces. The monks who inhabited the temple on Tuesdays were equally mysterious. They conducted their daily routines of meditation work and study with the same dedication found in any monastery. Yet their presence felt somehow translucent, as if they existed partially in this reality and partially in some other dimension. They welcomed Hiroshi warmly, but seemed unsurprised by his appearance, as if they had been expecting his visit despite his complete spontaneity in coming to the mountains. As evening approached, Hiroshi felt a growing anxiety about what would happen when Tuesday ended. Would he be trapped inside a vanishing temple caught between existence and non-existence? Would he disappear along with the buildings and reappear the following Tuesday? The monks seemed unconcerned by these questions, continuing their evening routines as if nothing unusual was approaching. Just before midnight, the head monk invited Hiroshi to join him in the main meditation hall for a special ceremony, marking the transition between existing and non-existing states. As they sat in silence, Hiroshi felt the temple beginning to fade around him, not suddenly but gradually, like fog dissipating in morning sunlight. The walls became translucent, then transparent, then disappeared entirely, leaving him sitting alone in the forest, clearing where he had first seen the stone archway. The experience left Hiroshi profoundly shaken and fundamentally changed. He returned to the village the next morning, his academic certainties shattered and his understanding of reality permanently altered. The tea merchant smiled knowingly when Hiroshi attempted to describe his experience, nodding as if he had heard similar accounts many times before. Hiroshi began visiting the site regularly, arriving each Monday evening and camping overnight to witness the temple's Tuesday manifestation. Each visit revealed new aspects of the phenomenon and deepened his understanding of the teaching being demonstrated. The temple was not simply a trick or illusion, but a genuine exploration of the conditional nature of existence itself. Over months of regular visits, Hiroshi began to perceive subtle signs of the temple's presence, even on non-Tuesday days. Traces of incense would linger in the air where the main hall should stand. Impressions in the earth showed where stone pathways had been walked by countless feet. The energy of the place remained constant even when the physical structures were absent. He realized that the temple's intermittent existence was teaching him about the difference between potential and actualization, between the underlying reality that supported all phenomena and the temporary manifestations that appeared within that reality. The mountain location always contained the possibility of the temple, but specific conditions were required for that possibility to become visible and tangible. The teaching extended beyond philosophy into practical understanding of how consciousness itself operated. Hiroshi began to notice how his own thoughts and perceptions appeared and disappeared according to conditions, existing fully when supported by attention and vanishing when that attention was withdrawn. The temple was serving as a metaphor for the conditional nature of all experience. Years passed, and Hiroshi's scholarly work took on entirely new dimensions. He wrote extensively about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality, using his temple experiences as a foundation for exploring how awareness itself might participate in the manifestation of phenomena. His colleagues found his work increasingly esoteric and difficult to understand, but Hiroshi was no longer concerned with academic approval. The temple continued to appear each Tuesday, welcoming visitors who were ready to encounter its teaching about conditional existence. Some came seeking miracles or supernatural experiences, but these seekers typically found nothing, arriving at the location on Tuesday mornings to discover only empty forest. The temple seemed to manifest only for those who approached with genuine openness to having their fundamental assumptions about reality challenged and transformed. Hiroshi eventually stopped his regular visits, having internalized the temple's primary teaching about the conditional nature of all phenomena. He carried this understanding into his daily life, recognizing how every experience, every relationship, every moment of existence arose and passed away according to countless interconnected conditions. The temple had served its purpose as a teacher, demonstrating through direct experience what could never be adequately conveyed through words or concepts alone: the farmer's good fortune. In a quiet village nestled between rolling hills and fertile fields, there lived an old farmer named Haruto. His life was marked by a series of events that seemed to unfold unpredictably, yet he met each with a calm acceptance that puzzled his neighbors and intrigued those who heard his story. One spring morning, Haruto's prized horse, a strong and beautiful creature that had served him well for many years, suddenly ran away. The villagers came to offer their condolences, believing this to be a great misfortune. But Haruto simply shrugged and said nothing more than a single word: maybe. Days later, the horse returned not alone, but accompanied by a wild stallion. The villagers now saw this as a stroke of incredible luck, congratulating Haruto on his newfound wealth. Yet, Haruto remained unmoved, repeating his simple response, maybe. Not long after, Haruto's son was riding one of the horses when he fell and broke his leg. The villagers lamented the accident, seeing it as a terrible tragedy. Haruto, however, maintained his calm demeanor and said once again, maybe. Soon after, a war broke out in the region, and all able-bodied young men were conscripted to fight. Because of his broken leg, Haruto's son was exempted from the draft. The villagers marveled at the twist of fate, calling it a blessing. Haruto, as always, responded with the same word, maybe. Throughout these events, Haruto's attitude never wavered. He neither celebrated nor mourned, understanding that the true nature of fortune and misfortune was intertwined and ever-changing. His neighbors began to see the wisdom in his words, realizing that life's events could not be judged as simply good or bad. Haruto's life was a testament to the natural rhythms of the earth. Each day, he rose with the sun, tending to his fields with a gentle hand and a patient heart. The soil beneath his feet was rich and dark, a living tapestry woven from seasons of growth and decay. He understood that the land, like life, was in constant flux, never static, always evolving. The villagers often sought Haruto's counsel, not because he was wealthy or powerful, but because of his serene presence. His eyes held a quiet depth, reflecting a mind untroubled by the usual worries that plagued others. When asked about the horse's disappearance, he would simply smile and offer his customary response. This single word carried a world of meaning, a refusal to be ensnared by fleeting circumstances. As the wild stallion joined the herd, Haruto observed the new dynamic with calm curiosity. The horses moved together with natural grace, their movements a dance choreographed by instinct and harmony. This unexpected addition to his stable was neither good nor bad. It simply was. The farmer continued his daily routines without alteration, feeding the animals, mending fences, and working the soil with the same steady rhythm he had maintained for decades. The accident that befell his son was a moment of challenge, yet Haruto's response remained unchanged. He tended to his son's injury with care and compassion, understanding that pain and healing were parts of the same cycle. The broken leg, while limiting, also spared his son from the horrors of war, a twist of fate that defied simple categorization. During the long weeks of recovery, father and son spent more time together than they had in years, sharing quiet conversations about the nature of existence and the unpredictability of human fortune. War brought fear and uncertainty to the region, but Haruto's home remained a sanctuary of peace. His philosophy spread quietly, influencing those around him to find balance amidst chaos. The villagers learned to see beyond immediate appearances, recognizing the deeper currents that shaped their lives. They began to understand that their farmer neighbor possessed a wisdom that transcended formal education or religious training. In quiet moments, Haruto would sit beneath the ancient oak tree at the edge of his fields, contemplating the nature of change. He saw life as a river flowing endlessly, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, but always moving forward. To resist this flow was to invite suffering. To embrace it was to find freedom. The oak itself served as a teacher, having weathered countless storms, seasons of drought and abundance, yet remaining rooted and steady through all transformations. The story of Haruto and his simple word spread far beyond the village boundaries, becoming a beacon of hope and wisdom. It reminded all who heard it that life's events are transient and that true peace comes from acceptance rather than resistance. This lesson, rooted in ancient wisdom traditions, transcended time and culture, touching the hearts of many who struggled with the constant fluctuations of human experience. As seasons turned and years passed, the village flourished not because of material wealth, but because of the collective peace that Haruto's example inspired. The people learned to greet each day with openness, ready to face whatever came with steady hearts and clear minds. Markets thrived not from aggressive competition, but from cooperative spirit. Neighbors helped one another through difficulties without expectation of reward, understanding that fortune and misfortune were temporary visitors in the lives of all people. The transformation was gradual but profound. Children grew up learning to respond to life's surprises with equanimity rather than reactive emotion. Adults found themselves less anxious about future uncertainties, more capable of finding contentment in present circumstances. The elderly discovered new appreciation for the wisdom they had accumulated through decades of varied experiences, recognizing that every joy and sorrow had contributed to their understanding of life's deeper patterns. Haruto's approach to existence became a living philosophy that influenced every aspect of village life. When crops failed due to unexpected weather, farmers responded with practical adaptation rather than despair. When abundant harvests exceeded expectations, celebrations remained moderate, tempered by awareness that conditions would inevitably change again. Business transactions were conducted with fairness and patience, understanding that immediate profits mattered less than long-term relationships built on trust and mutual respect. The farmer's wisdom extended beyond personal philosophy into practical application. He had learned through decades of agricultural work that forcing outcomes rarely produced desired results. Seeds planted too early might be destroyed by late frost, while those planted too late might not mature before autumn's first freeze. The timing of planting, cultivating, and harvesting required sensitivity to countless variables that could not be controlled, only observed and accommodated. This agricultural wisdom translated directly into his approach to human relationships and social interactions. Just as he allowed crops to grow according to their natural rhythms, he allowed people to develop and change at their own pace. He offered guidance when asked, but never imposed his perspectives on others. His presence itself became a teaching, demonstrating how inner peace could be maintained regardless of external circumstances. Visitors from distant places began arriving in the village, drawn by stories of the farmer whose simple response to life's complexities had created a community of unusual harmony and contentment. Some came seeking dramatic revelations or complex philosophical systems, only to discover that Haruto's wisdom was almost disappointingly simple. His teaching required no special knowledge, no elaborate practices, no expensive materials or lengthy training periods. The profound simplicity of his approach initially frustrated those accustomed to more complicated spiritual or philosophical frameworks. How could a single word contain such transformative power? How could acceptance of uncertainty produce greater security than attempts to control outcomes? Gradually, however, visitors began to understand that the power lay not in the word itself, but in the complete commitment to its implications. Years accumulated, and Haruto aged with the same grace he had brought to all life's changes. His hair whitened, his movements slowed, his voice became softer, yet his fundamental equanimity remained constant. The villagers who had once puzzled over his responses now understood them as expressions of deep wisdom about the nature of existence itself. His legacy was not in any written teachings or formal institutions, but in the living example of how to navigate life's inevitable uncertainties with dignity and peace. In the end, Haruto's good fortune was not measured by the events that befell him, but by the unshakable calm that defined his spirit. His life was a living testament to the power of equanimity, a lesson that continues to resonate in the hearts of those who seek true understanding. The Tea Master's last ceremony. Master Ichiro had devoted 43 years of his life to the way of tea, perfecting every gesture and movement until the ceremony became as natural as breathing. His small tea house, tucked away in a quiet corner of Kyoto, attracted students and admirers who sought to learn not just the technical aspects of the ritual, but the deeper spiritual principles that transformed simple tea preparation into a meditation on presence and impermanence. The morning that would change everything began like countless others. Ichiro rose before dawn, swept the garden paths, arranged fresh flowers in the tokonoma alcove, and prepared his utensils with the same careful attention he had practiced for decades. The ceramic tea bowls, each one chosen for its subtle imperfections that spoke of human craftsmanship over machine precision, were cleaned and arranged according to the season and the particular qualities of his expected guests. A samurai named Takeshi arrived at the tea house just as the morning mist was lifting from the carefully raked gravel garden. His presence immediately altered the peaceful atmosphere that Ichiro cultivated so carefully. Takeshi was known throughout the district for his skill with the sword and his quick temper, a dangerous combination that had led to numerous duels and several deaths. His reasons for seeking out the humble tea master were initially unclear, but his aggressive posture and barely controlled anger suggested this was not a social visit. Ichiro welcomed the samurai with the same courteous bow he offered to all visitors, neither more nor less deferential. despite the obvious threat this man represented. The tea master had learned through decades of practice that true courtesy arose from genuine respect for the essential humanity in every person, regardless of their social position or apparent intentions. He invited Takeshi to enter the tea house through the traditional low doorway that required all visitors, regardless of rank, to humble themselves in the act of entering the sacred space. The samurai's complaint was both personal and humiliating. He accused Ichiro of insulting his honor during a gathering at a local merchant's house, claiming that the tea master had deliberately served him inferior tea while honoring other guests with the finest blend. The accusation was false, as Ichiro served the same carefully selected tea to all guests, but Takeshi's pride had been wounded by what he perceived as deliberate slight, and his warrior's code demanded satisfaction through combat. Ichiro listened to the accusations without defending himself or attempting to explain the misunderstanding. He understood that Takeshi's anger arose not from the quality of tea, but from deeper insecurities and the rigid social expectations that governed samurai behavior. The tea master had encountered similar situations before, though none had escalated to demands for armed combat. His response was characteristically calm and measured, neither apologetic nor confrontational. The challenge was formal and unavoidable. Takeshi demanded that Ichiro meet him at dawn the following day in the bamboo grove behind the Kinkakuji temple, armed with a sword for single combat. The samurai's honor required this satisfaction, and refusal would result in immediate execution for cowardice. Ichiro accepted the challenge with the same equanimity he brought to all aspects of his life, understanding that this moment had arrived through the complex interplay of circumstances beyond his control. That evening, Ichiro prepared for what might be his final tea ceremony. He invited his most devoted students to join him, though he did not reveal the specific reason for this gathering. The ceremony proceeded with unusual intensity and focus, each movement performed with complete attention and presence. The students sensed something different in their master's demeanor, a heightened awareness that transformed the familiar ritual into something extraordinary. As he whisked the matcha into perfect foam, Ichiro reflected on the parallels between tea ceremony and the approaching duel. Both required complete presence, total attention to the immediate moment, and acceptance of whatever outcome might arise. The tea master realized that his 43 years of practice had been preparing him not just for serving tea, but for this ultimate test of his spiritual development. The night passed in quiet meditation. Ichiro sat in the garden, observing the moon's passage across the sky and listening to the subtle sounds of the city settling into sleep. He felt no fear or regret, only a deep appreciation for the privilege of having devoted his life to the way of tea and the profound lessons it had taught him about presence, acceptance, and the beautiful impermanence of all phenomena. Dawn arrived with unusual clarity, the air crisp and still, as if nature itself was holding its breath there. Ichiro performed his morning ablutions with extra care, donning his best kimono and arranging his hair with the same precision he brought to preparing tea utensils. He had never held a sword in combat, but he carried the short wakizashi that his father had given him decades earlier more as a symbol than as a weapon. He knew how to use effectively. The bamboo grove was silent except for the gentle rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. Takeshi was already waiting, his longer katana drawn and gleaming in the filtered sunlight. The samurai had brought witnesses, other warriors, who would ensure that the duel was conducted according to proper form and that its outcome would be officially recorded. As the two men faced each other across the small clearing, Ichiro found himself entering the same mental state he cultivated during tea ceremony. Time seemed to slow, and his awareness expanded to encompass every detail. Of the moment, the pattern of light and shadow on the bamboo stalks, the distant sound of temple bells marking the hour, the steady rhythm of his own breathing, the weight of the sword in his unaccustomed grip. Takeshi attacked with the fluid precision of a master swordsman, his blade cutting through the air with deadly efficiency. Yet Ichiro, moving with the same mindful presence he brought to lifting a tea bowl, somehow managed to avoid the strike. His movement was not the calculated defense of a trained warrior, but the natural response of someone completely present in the moment, responding to what was actually happening rather than what he feared might happen. The samurai's surprise at missing his initial attack created a moment of uncertainty that Ichiro neither exploited nor ignored. Instead, he maintained his stance of alert relaxation, neither aggressive nor defensive, simply present and responsive to whatever might unfold. His breathing remained steady, his grip on the sword neither tight nor loose, his feet positioned as if he were about to serve tea to an honored guest. Takeshi's second attack was more cautious, a probing thrust designed to test his opponent's defenses. Again, Ichiro responded with the same quality of presence that had characterized his tea ceremonies, moving with natural grace that seemed to flow directly from his centered awareness. The tea master's movements were economical and precise, containing no wasted motion or unnecessary flourish. The duel continued for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. Takeshi's growing frustration with his inability to land a decisive blow began to affect his technique, causing him to overextend and leave openings that a more experienced fighter would have exploited. Yet Ichiro made no aggressive moves, content to respond to each attack with the same quality of mindful presence that had become second nature through decades of tea practice. Gradually, the samurai's attacks became less precise and more desperate. His warrior's training had prepared him for combat with other skilled swordsmen, but he had never encountered an opponent who moved with such strange calm and centeredness. Ichiro's presence was affecting Takeshi in ways the samurai could not understand, undermining his confidence and disrupting his normal fighting rhythm. In a moment of complete stillness between attacks, both men stood facing each other in perfect balance. Takeshi's sword was raised for another strike, while Ichiro waited with the same patient attention he brought to the moment when hot water first touched powdered tea. In that suspended instant, something fundamental shifted in the samurai's understanding. Takeshi lowered his sword and bowed deeply to the tea master, acknowledging not defeat in combat, but recognition of a different kind of mastery altogether. He had encountered something in Ichiro's presence that transcended martial skill, a quality of being that rendered physical conflict unnecessary and meaningless. The samurai's honor was satisfied not through victory but through understanding. The witnesses to the duel spread the story throughout Kyoto, though each telling emphasized different aspects of what they had observed. Some focused on the tea master's miraculous survival against a superior swordsman, while others spoke of the transformation they had witnessed in Takeshi's demeanor. The most perceptive observers understood that they had witnessed a demonstration of how complete presence could transform even the most threatening situations. Ichiro returned to his tea house and resumed his normal routine as if nothing unusual had occurred. His students noticed a deepened quality in his teachings, a greater emphasis on the spiritual dimensions of presence and awareness that the tea ceremony cultivated. The master spoke little about his encounter with the samurai, preferring to let the experience inform his practice rather than become a story to be retold. Years passed, and the incident became part of local legend, though Ichiro himself rarely mentioned it. Students who asked about the jewel received gentle redirection toward their own practice, encouraged to discover through direct experience how complete presence could transform their relationship to challenge and conflict. The tea master understood that his survival had been less important than the lesson it provided about the power of centered awareness in any circumstance. The way of tea had prepared him not for combat, but for life itself, teaching him to meet each moment with complete attention and acceptance. Whether serving tea to guests or facing a sword-wielding samurai, the same principles applied: presence, awareness, and surrender to the natural unfolding of events beyond personal control. The Buddha's flower sermon, the morning of the Great Assembly, began with unusual stillness across the Gridhrakuta mountain. 500 disciples had gathered in response to word that the Buddha would deliver a special teaching, though none could say precisely what made this occasion different from the countless other Dharma talks they had attended over the years. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation as monks, nuns, and lay people arranged themselves in the traditional semicircle before the simple rock outcropping that served as the Buddha's seat. Among the assembled disciples, Mahakasyapa sat in his customary position near the front, his weathered face reflecting decades of intensive meditation practice. His presence was notable for its complete stillness, a quality that had developed through years of observing the subtle movements of mind and the even subtler spaces between thoughts. Unlike many of the other disciples who fidgeted slightly or adjusted their robes in the pre-dawn cool, Mahakasyapa had achieved a state of perfect equilibrium that required no external adjustment or internal commentary. The Buddha approached the gathering with his usual measured pace, each step placed with complete awareness on the rocky mountain path. His movements contained no urgency, despite the large crowd waiting for his arrival, no sense of performance or preparation for the teaching ahead. Those who had studied his demeanor over many years recognized this particular quality of presence, a depth of stillness that seemed to emanate from some inexhaustible source within his being. As the Buddha seated himself on the flat stone that had become his customary teaching place, the assembled disciples fell into complete silence. The usual sounds of settling robes and quiet coughs disappeared, replaced by an expectant hush that seemed to extend beyond the human gathering to encompass the entire mountainside. Even the birds and insects appeared to pause their morning activities as if nature itself was preparing to receive whatever teaching was about to unfold. The disciples waited for the familiar opening words that typically began the Buddha's discourses. They expected exposition on the Four Noble Truths, exploration of the Eightfold Path, or detailed analysis of the various mental formations that created suffering and liberation. The scholars among them had prepared their memories to capture and preserve whatever wisdom would be offered, while the practitioners readied themselves to receive guidance for their meditation and daily conduct. Instead of speaking, the Buddha reached into the folds of his robe and withdrew a single flower. The blossom was unremarkable. In most respects, a simple golden lotus that might have been picked from any of the ponds scattered throughout the region. Its petals showed the natural variations and subtle imperfections that characterized all living things, neither perfect in form nor particularly striking in color or size. Yet, as the Buddha held it aloft, the flower seemed to become the most significant object in the universe. Minutes passed in complete silence. The Buddha's gaze rested on the flower with the same quality of attention he brought to all phenomena, neither analyzing nor categorizing, but simply witnessing its present moment reality. His hand remained steady, holding the stem with gentle firmness that supported the blossom without constraining its natural form. The flower itself seemed to respond to this quality of attention, its petals catching the morning light in ways that revealed previously unnoticed subtleties of color and texture. The assembled disciples began to experience various forms of discomfort as the silence stretched beyond normal boundaries. Some shifted positions, wondering if they had missed some verbal teaching that preceded the display of the flower. Others searched their memories of previous teachings, trying to recall symbolic meanings associated with lotus blossoms or floral metaphors that might explain the Buddha's current action. The scholars particularly struggled with the absence of conceptual content, having trained themselves to capture and analyze the Buddha's words rather than simply receive his presence. As more time passed, without explanation or elaboration, different disciples responded according to their individual temperaments and levels of understanding. The intellectually inclined grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of verbal teaching, their minds generating elaborate theories about hidden meanings and symbolic significance. The emotionally oriented felt various forms of anxiety or confusion, uncertain how to respond appropriately to such an unusual situation. The practically minded wondered if this was some new form of meditation instruction that required specific techniques or mental approaches. Yet, through all these various responses and internal commentaries, the Buddha continued to hold the flower with the same unwavering presence. His attention neither wavered nor intensified, but remained perfectly steady, demonstrating a quality of awareness that encompassed the flower, the assembled disciples, and the entire mountain environment without preference or discrimination. The teaching was occurring continuously, though not in the form that most disciples expected or knew how to receive. Mahakasyapa, however, experienced something entirely different as he observed the Buddha's silent demonstration. Rather than generating questions or theories about meaning, he found himself entering into direct communion with the reality being presented. The flower in the Buddha's hand was not a symbol pointing toward some abstract truth, but was itself the complete teaching, containing within its simple presence all the wisdom that could ever be transmitted through words or concepts. In that moment of recognition, Mahakasyapa's face broke into a subtle smile that reflected not amusement or happiness, but the profound joy of understanding. The smile arose spontaneously from the depths of his being, an expression of the natural delight that emerges when the mind ceases its constant searching and commentary and simply rests in the immediacy of what is actually present. This smile was not directed toward the Buddha or the flower, but was the natural expression of awakened awareness encountering its own essential nature. The Buddha's response to Mahakasyapa's smile was immediate and unmistakable. Without speaking, he conveyed complete recognition and approval, acknowledging that the true teaching had been received and understood. The transmission that occurred in that moment transcended all the verbal teachings that had been given over many years, pointing directly to the wordless wisdom that could only be communicated from mind to mind in perfect silence. The other disciples gradually became aware that something significant had transpired between the Buddha and Mahakasyapa, though most could not identify precisely what had occurred. The quality of presence in the gathering had shifted subtly, as if some invisible transaction had been completed. Those with deeper understanding sensed that they had witnessed a form of teaching that operated on entirely different principles than conceptual instruction or moral guidance. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only minutes, the Buddha gently lowered the flower and spoke briefly to formally conclude the gathering. His words were simple and direct, offering no explanation of what had just occurred or interpretation of its significance. The teaching was complete, as it stood requiring no elaboration or commentary to fulfill its essential purpose. As the disciples began to disperse, many felt confused and somewhat disappointed by the absence of conventional teaching. They had gathered expecting profound insights into the nature of reality, practical guidance for their spiritual practice, or answers to long-standing questions about the Dharma. Instead, they had witnessed what appeared to be a meaningless display of botanical appreciation, followed by an inexplicable exchange of smiles between teacher and student. Yet for those with eyes to see, the flower sermon represented the most direct possible transmission of the Buddha's essential realization. All the verbal teachings, elaborate philosophical explanations, and detailed meditation instructions were ultimately pointing toward the same simple truth that could be communicated completely through the silent presentation of a single flower. The reality being pointed to was already present and available in every moment, requiring no special knowledge or complex practices to access. The teaching spread through the Buddhist community in ways that conventional discourses never could. Stories of the flower sermon were told and retold, each version emphasizing different aspects of what had occurred. Some focused on the mysterious communication between Buddha and Mahakasyapa, while others emphasized the revolutionary nature of wordless transmission. The most perceptive accounts recognized that the real teaching lay not in the specific events of that morning, but in the invitation to discover the same quality of direct understanding in every present moment. Mahakasyapa himself rarely spoke about his experience during the flower sermon, understanding that the teaching could not be conveyed through description or analysis. When questioned by other disciples, he would simply smile the same subtle smile that had first appeared during the Buddha's demonstration, inviting others to discover for themselves the reality that could not be captured in concepts or words. The flower sermon became a founding moment in what would later be called the Zen tradition, representing the beginning of a lineage of direct transmission that bypassed conventional methods of spiritual instruction. Yet, even this historical significance was secondary to the immediate reality that the teaching pointed toward the ever-present possibility of awakening to the truth that exists before and beyond all words, concepts, and explanations. Years later, disciples would gather flowers and hold them aloft, attempting to recreate the Buddha's demonstration. Yet, these imitations missed the essential point, focusing on the external form rather than the quality of presence that had made the original teaching so profound. The flower in the Buddha's hand was significant not because it was a flower, but because it was held with complete presence and received with complete understanding. The true teaching continued to unfold in countless moments of direct recognition whenever someone encountered reality, without the filter of conceptual interpretation or the burden of seeking something other than what was immediately present. The flower sermon was not a historical event that occurred once and ended, but an ongoing invitation to discover the same wordless transmission in the simple phenomena of everyday experience. The Zen master's death master, Yamada, had reached his 87th year when the first signs of his approaching death became unmistakable. The monastery, where he had taught for over 4 decades, recognized the subtle changes in his demeanor and daily routines that indicated the natural conclusion of a life fully lived. His movements, once fluid and purposeful, had taken on a different quality of attention, as if he were participating in the world while simultaneously preparing to depart from it. The master's morning walks through the temple gardens became shorter but more intentional. He would pause longer at certain spots, observing the interplay of light and shadow, with the absorbed attention of someone seeing familiar sights for what might be the final time. His students noticed that he touched objects differently, his fingers lingering on the smooth surface of stone lanterns or the rough bark of ancient pine trees, with a quality of farewell that was both tender and complete. During the autumn months, Master Yamada began the process of formally transferring his responsibilities to the senior monks who would continue the monastery's operations after his departure. These transitions were handled with the same methodical care he had brought to all aspects of temple life, each duty passed along with detailed instructions and the accumulated wisdom of decades of experience. Yet, beneath this practical preparation lay a deeper teaching about the impermanent nature of all roles and positions, including that of spiritual teacher. The master's evening talks to the assembled community took on a different character as well. Rather than introducing new concepts or exploring complex philosophical questions, he began returning to the most fundamental teachings, presenting them with a clarity and simplicity that came from having lived their truth for many years. His words carried the weight of complete understanding, delivered without the need to convince or persuade, but simply offered as gifts to those ready to receive them. Winter arrived early that year, covering the mountain monastery with an unusually heavy blanket of snow that isolated the community from the outside world for weeks at a time. Master Yamada seemed to welcome this natural seclusion, using the enforced quietude to deepen his already profound meditation practice. He would sit for hours in the main hall, his presence so still and centered that younger monks would sometimes question whether he was still breathing. As spring approached and the master's physical condition continued to decline, his students began experiencing various forms of anxiety about the approaching loss of their teacher. Some threw themselves into intensive meditation practice, hoping to achieve breakthrough insights before their guide was no longer available. Others became obsessively devoted to preserving his teachings, writing down every word and gesture in elaborate detail. A few withdrew into private grief, already mourning the absence of someone who was still very much present. Master Yamada observed these responses with gentle compassion, understanding that each student was processing the reality of impermanence according to their individual temperament and level of spiritual development. He neither encouraged nor discouraged these various approaches, recognizing that the experience of confronting mortality was itself a powerful teaching that would unfold differently for each person involved. One morning in late spring, as cherry blossoms filled the temple courtyards with their brief and poignant beauty, Master Yamada announced that his death was imminent. He made this statement with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to comment on the weather neither dramatic nor emotional, but simply factual. He requested that all members of the community gather in the main hall that evening for what he described as his final teaching. The announcement created a mixture of anticipation and dread throughout the monastery. Students who had been with the master for decades struggled with the reality that their time together was measured in hours rather than years. Newer arrivals felt particularly acute anxiety about losing their teacher before fully benefiting from his guidance. The entire community moved through their daily routines with heightened awareness, as if the approaching event had rendered every ordinary activity suddenly precious and significant. As evening approached, the main hall filled with a gathering unlike any in the monastery's history. Not only the resident community, but also former students, local supporters, and visitors who had somehow learned of the occasion arranged themselves in concentric circles around the master's usual teaching position. The atmosphere was charged with expectation, grief, curiosity, and hope as people prepared to receive whatever final wisdom their teacher might offer. Master Yama entered the hall at precisely the moment when the last light of day disappeared behind the mountains. His walk to the front of the assembly was steady despite his frail condition, each step placed with the complete attention that had characterized all his movements throughout his life. He seated himself on the simple cushion he had occupied for countless teachings over the decades, his posture erect and dignified, despite the obvious effort this required. The assembled community waited in complete silence for what seemed like an extended period. Many expected a comprehensive summary of the master's spiritual insights, a final discourse that would encapsulate decades of wisdom into memorable form. Others anticipated practical guidance for continuing their practice, without his direct supervision, detailed instructions for maintaining the monastery's traditions and spiritual standards. The scholars among them prepared to capture and preserve whatever profound final statements might emerge. When Master Yamada finally spoke, his voice was clear and strong, despite his physical weakness. He thanked everyone for gathering and acknowledged the love and devotion that had sustained the community throughout his years of teaching. He expressed gratitude for the privilege of sharing the Dharma with so many sincere seekers and for the countless ways that students had contributed to his own understanding through their questions, insights, and dedicated practice. Then, after this brief preamble, the master announced that he was ready to respond to any final questions the community might have. This invitation surprised many who had expected a formal lecture or systematic presentation of teachings. Instead, he was offering a more intimate and responsive conclusion to his teaching career, one that would emerge organically from the actual concerns and curiosities of his students. The first question came from a senior monk who had practiced under Master Yamada's guidance for over 20 years. He asked about the best way to honor the master's memory and continue his spiritual legacy after his death. The master's response emphasized the importance of authentic practice over memorial activities, suggesting that the most meaningful tribute would be each student's continued commitment to awakening rather than the preservation of his personal reputation or influence. A younger student asked about the fear of death and how to face mortality with equanimity. Master Yamada spoke briefly about death as a natural transition rather than a termination, comparing it to the changing of seasons or the movement from one room to another. He emphasized that fear of death was primarily fear of the unknown, and that meditation practice gradually familiarized practitioners with states of consciousness that transcended ordinary waking awareness. Several questions focused on practical matters of maintaining the monastery's operations and continuing the transmission of teachings to future generations. The master's responses were pragmatic and encouraging, emphasizing the importance of collective responsibility and the natural emergence of leadership from within the community itself. He expressed complete confidence in the students' ability to preserve and transmit the essential teachings without his direct oversight. As the evening progressed and various questions were asked and answered, the assembled community began to relax into the familiar rhythm of question and response that had characterized so many Dharma talks over the years. The approaching death that had seemed so momentous and dramatic was being approached with the same natural simplicity that Master Yamada brought to all aspects of life and teaching. Near the end of the session, a very young student who had arrived at the monastery only months earlier raised her hand tentatively. When recognized, she asked in a voice barely above a whisper what the Master's final words of wisdom would be for someone just beginning the spiritual path. The question carried particular poignancy, given the timing, and the entire hall focused intently on Master Yamada's response. The Master smiled gently and appeared to consider the question carefully before responding. His answer, when it came, was so simple and unexpected that many initially wondered if they had heard correctly. He suggested that the young student should remember to sweep the front steps of the monastery each morning with complete attention, ensuring that visitors encountered a clean and welcoming entrance. The response initially puzzled many in the assembly, who had expected profound philosophical insights or mystical revelations. How could such mundane practical advice constitute appropriate final wisdom from a master of such accomplishment and reputation? Some wondered if age and illness had affected his mental clarity, while others assumed there must be hidden symbolic meanings that would become apparent upon reflection. Yet, as Master Yamada continued speaking, the wisdom embedded in his simple response began to emerge. He explained that spiritual awakening was not found in extraordinary experiences or complex philosophical understanding, but in the complete presence brought to ordinary activities. Sweeping steps with full attention was no different from the highest forms of meditation if performed with genuine mindfulness and care for others. The Master elaborated that every moment of life offered the same opportunity for complete presence and compassionate action that formal meditation periods provided. The young student's daily step sweeping could become a perfect spiritual practice if approached with the right understanding and intention. There was nothing ordinary about ordinary activities when performed with extraordinary presence and attention. As his final teaching drew to a close, Master Yamada emphasized that the Dharma was transmitted not through special words or dramatic gestures, but through the accumulation of countless small acts of awareness and kindness. The monastery's true purpose was not to create impressive spiritual achievements, but to cultivate the capacity for complete presence in whatever circumstances life presented. The Master concluded by expressing his deep gratitude for the privilege of sharing these years with such dedicated students and his complete confidence in their ability to continue the work of awakening with or without his physical presence. He reminded them that true teachers are everywhere and in everything for those with eyes to see, and that his death would simply remove one external support while strengthening their reliance on the inner wisdom that was their birthright. As dawn approached, Master Yamada quietly returned to his quarters and died peacefully in his sleep, his final teaching complete. The young student began sweeping the monastery steps the next morning and continued this practice for the rest of her life, discovering in this simple daily task the complete path to enlightenment that her teacher had promised. The monastery, Cat in the Mountain, monastery of Rinnaiji, where morning mist clung to ancient cedar groves and the sound of temple bells echoed through valleys carved by centuries of wind and rain. The monks had maintained their daily routine of meditation work and study for over 400 years. Their lives followed the natural rhythms of the seasons, rising before dawn. For morning meditation, tending the temple gardens during the day, and gathering for evening chanting as darkness settled over the mountain peaks. The tranquility of this ancient rhythm was gradually disrupted by an invasion that began so subtly that months passed before the monks fully recognized the extent of the problem. Mice had discovered the monastery's stores of rice and vegetables, establishing colonies in the walls and ceiling spaces that provided warm shelter and abundant food. What started as occasional rustling sounds during meditation periods evolved into a constant distraction that undermined the profound silence the monks cultivated as the foundation of their spiritual practice. The senior monks initially attempted to address the situation through various means that aligned with their commitment to non-violence. They sealed storage containers more carefully, cleaned the kitchen areas with greater thoroughness, and even tried relocating their meditation sessions to different halls where the sounds might be less intrusive. Yet the mouse population continued to expand, and their nocturnal activities grew increasingly bold and disruptive. During the autumn months, as the first snows began dusting the mountain peaks, the situation reached a crisis point. The mice had not only consumed significant portions of the monastery's winter food supplies, but had begun appearing during daylight hours, scurrying across the meditation hall floors in full view of the seated monks. The younger practitioners found their concentration completely shattered by these intrusions, while even the most experienced meditators acknowledged that the constant rustling and scratching had created an environment incompatible with deep spiritual practice. The abbot, a man of 73 years, who had spent 5 decades in monastic life, called a formal gathering of all community members to address the crisis. The assembly took place in the main hall on a cold November evening, with 47 monks arranging themselves in the traditional semicircle before their teacher's simple wooden chair. The discussion that followed reflected the community's struggle to balance their commitment to non-violence with their practical need to maintain an environment conducive to meditation and study. Some monks suggested more elaborate physical barriers and storage methods, while others proposed relocating to different buildings or even different seasons for intensive meditation retreats. A few advocated for simply accepting the situation as a teaching about impermanence and the impossibility of controlling external conditions. Yet, as the discussion continued, it became clear that none of these approaches would adequately address the fundamental problem without compromising either the monastery's spiritual mission or its practical sustainability. Finally, one of the senior monks raised the possibility that had been unspoken but present in everyone's minds, bringing a cat to the monastery. The suggestion created immediate tension as it represented a significant departure from the community's traditional practices and raised complex questions about the relationship between spiritual ideals and practical necessities. The monks spent hours exploring the ethical implications, examining whether introducing a natural predator could be reconciled with their vows of non-violence. and their commitment to protecting all living beings. After extensive deliberation and meditation on the question, the community reached a consensus that acquiring a cat represented the most compassionate solution available under the circumstances. They reasoned that the current situation was causing suffering for both the human community and the mice themselves, who were living in conditions that would ultimately prove unsustainable. A cat's presence would restore natural balance rather than imposing artificial violence, allowing both species to coexist within their appropriate ecological relationships. The following spring, a small black cat arrived at the monastery through the assistance of villagers from the nearest town. The animal was young but fully grown, with sleek fur that absorbed light like deep water and amber eyes that reflected an intelligence both alert and serene. The monks named the cat Kuro, meaning black, though they quickly discovered that this simple designation could not capture the complex presence the animal brought to their community. Kuro adapted to monastic life with remarkable ease, as if the rhythm of bells and chanting had always been part of its natural environment. The cat moved through the temple buildings with silent grace, its presence barely noticeable except for the gradual disappearance of the mice that had plagued the community for so many months. Within weeks, the scratching and rustling that had disrupted meditation sessions became rare occurrences, and within 2 months, they had ceased entirely. Yet, Kuro's impact on the monastery extended far beyond its effectiveness as a pest controller. The cat seemed to embody qualities that the monks themselves aspired to cultivate through decades of spiritual practice. Its movements demonstrated perfect mindfulness, each step placed with complete attention and awareness. Its periods of rest showed the profound stillness that the monks sought in their meditation, while its moments of activity displayed the effortless action that arose from deep presence rather than driven effort. The monks found themselves observing Kuro with the same careful attention they brought to studying sacred texts or examining their own mental processes during meditation. The cat's behavior became a source of teaching that operated without words or concepts, demonstrating through direct example the qualities of presence, patience, and natural wisdom that formed the heart of Zen practice. During the summer months, Kuro established routines that complemented the monastery's daily schedule. The cat would appear in the meditation hall each morning just after the dawn sitting, began positioning itself near the altar where its black form seemed to merge with the shadows cast by flickering candles. It would remain perfectly still throughout the meditation period, its breathing so subtle that younger monks would sometimes glance over to confirm that the animal was still alive. Kuro's presence during these meditation sessions created an atmosphere of enhanced stillness that the entire community recognized and appreciated. The cat seemed to generate a field of calm attention that supported and deepened the monks' own practice. Many reported that their meditation reached greater depths of concentration when Kuro was present, as if the animal's natural mindfulness amplified their own capacity for awareness and presence. The afternoon work periods also revealed Kuro's remarkable integration into monastic life. While the monks tended gardens, cleaned buildings, or prepared meals, the cat would position itself where it could observe the activities without interfering. Its watchful presence seemed to inspire greater mindfulness in the human workers, who found themselves moving with more deliberate care and attention when they felt those amber eyes following their movements. Evenings brought perhaps the most profound demonstrations of Kuro's spiritual presence. During the community's chanting sessions, the cat would seat itself in the center of the hall, its posture erect and dignified, its eyes partially closed, in what appeared to be deep listening. The monks began to notice that the quality of their chanting improved when Kuro was present, their voices blending more harmoniously and their attention remaining more focused on the sacred syllables they repeated. As seasons turned and years passed, Kuro became not just a resident of the monastery, but an integral part of its spiritual life. Visitors often commented on the unusual atmosphere of peace and presence that seemed to permeate the temple grounds, though few realized how much the cat's silent influence contributed to this quality. The animal had become a living teaching, demonstrating without effort or self-consciousness the very qualities that the monks worked so diligently to cultivate through formal practice. The deeper teachings that Kuro embodied became sources of regular reflection and discussion among the community members. The cat's complete presence in each moment illustrated the Buddhist principle of mindfulness more clearly than any verbal explanation could convey. Its natural acceptance of whatever circumstances arose demonstrated the equanimity that the monks sought to develop through meditation and study. Most significantly, Kuro's effortless embodiment of these qualities suggested that enlightenment was not something to be achieved through struggle and effort, but rather uncovered through the removal of obstacles to one's natural wisdom and compassion. Yet, even as the community deeply appreciated Kuro's presence and teachings, the senior monks remained vigilant about maintaining proper perspective on the cat's role in monastery life. They reminded younger practitioners that Kuro was a fellow being deserving of care and respect, not an object of worship or a source of supernatural power. The cat's value lay not in any mystical abilities, but in its natural demonstration of the mindfulness and presence that were available to all beings willing to cultivate these qualities. When Kuro reached advanced age after 8 years in the monastery, the changes in the cat's condition became a teaching about impermanence that affected the entire community. The sleek black fur began showing patches of gray, the graceful movements slowed, and the periods of sleep grew longer and deeper. Yet, even in decline, Kuro maintained the essential qualities of presence and awareness that had made such a profound impression on the monks throughout the years of vigorous health. The cat's final months were marked by a gentle withdrawal from active participation in monastery life, though Kuro continued to appear for morning meditation sessions until just days before death arrived. The monks provided careful nursing care, ensuring that their longtime companion experienced comfort and dignity throughout the natural process of aging and decline. They recognized this period as an opportunity to practice the compassion and non-attachment that formed central pillars of their spiritual training. When Kuro died peacefully on a spring morning, the entire monastery felt the profound absence left by the passing of such a significant presence. The monks gathered that evening for a special ceremony honoring the cat's contribution to their community and acknowledging the grief that naturally arose from the loss of a beloved friend and teacher. They shared stories of particular moments when Kuro's presence had deepened their understanding or inspired their practice, creating a collective memory that would preserve the cat's spiritual legacy. In the weeks following Kuro's death, several monks proposed creating a memorial that would honor the cat's memory and preserve the teachings that its presence had embodied. After considerable discussion, the community decided to commission a stone statue that would capture Kuro's characteristic meditation posture and serene expression. A skilled craftsman from the nearby town carved the memorial from local granite, creating a figure that perfectly captured the cat's dignified bearing and alert repose. The statue was installed in the temple garden, in a location where Kuro had often rested during sunny afternoons, surrounded by the bamboo groves and flowering shrubs that the cat had seemed to particularly enjoy. The memorial's placement allowed it to be visible from the meditation hall, providing a constant reminder of the qualities that Kuro had embodied and the teachings that its presence had offered to the community. Initially, the statue served its intended purpose as a simple memorial that helped the monks remember and honor their departed friend. Visitors to the monastery would often pause before the figure touched by the story of the cat, whose presence had so profoundly influenced the spiritual life of the community. The memorial became a focal point for reflection on the teachings about impermanence, presence, and the unexpected sources from which wisdom could emerge. However, as months and years passed, the statue began to acquire significance that extended beyond its original purpose as a simple memorial. New generations of monks who had never known the living Kuro learned about the cat primarily through stories and the constant presence of the stone figure. For these younger practitioners, the statue became not just a representation of a deceased animal, but a symbol of spiritual protection and guidance. Gradually, without any official decision or conscious intention, the statue began to be treated with a reverence that approached worship. Monks would bow before it during their daily walks through the garden, and some began leaving small offerings of flowers or incense at its base. Visitors to the monastery, hearing the remarkable story of Kuro's spiritual influence, began treating the statue as a source of blessing and good fortune, requesting special prayers or making donations in the cat's honor. The transformation was so gradual that several years passed before the senior monks fully recognized how the community's relationship with the memorial had evolved. What had begun as a simple tribute to a beloved companion had become something approaching an object of religious veneration, complete with ritual practices and superstitious beliefs about the statue's power to grant requests or provide spiritual protection. This development troubled the more perceptive members of the community, who recognized that the veneration of Kuro's statue represented exactly the kind of attachment to external forms that Buddhist teaching warned against. The irony was particularly acute, given that the living cat had demonstrated the very qualities of non-attachment and natural presence that the statue worship contradicted. The monks had allowed their grief and fond memories to create the kind of spiritual materialism that their tradition consistently identified as an obstacle to genuine understanding. A few senior monks began raising gentle questions about the community's relationship with the memorial, suggesting that their practices around the statue might be diverting attention from the living qualities that Kuro had actually embodied. They reminded their colleagues that the cat's teaching had been about presence and awareness in each moment, not about devotion to symbolic representations or belief in external sources of spiritual power. These conversations initiated a period of deep reflection within the monastery about the nature of spiritual practice and the subtle ways that attachments could develop even within the context of sincere religious seeking. The monks began to examine how their genuine love and appreciation for Kuro had gradually transformed into something that contradicted the very teachings the cat had demonstrated through its simple presence and natural behavior. The community held special gatherings to discuss the lessons emerging from their experience with the statue, recognizing that this situation had become a teaching opportunity about the dangers of confusing symbols with reality, form with essence, and external objects with internal development. They acknowledged that their attachment to Kuro's memory, however understandable and well-intentioned, had led them away from the direct experience of presence and awareness that the cat had actually demonstrated. Through these discussions, the monks came to understand that the most authentic way to honor Kuro's memory was not through ritual veneration of its statue, but through embodying the qualities of mindfulness, presence, and natural compassion that the cat had exemplified throughout its life in the monastery. The true teaching was not preserved in stone, but lived through the ongoing practice of awareness and the cultivation of the same effortless presence that had made Kuro such a profound teacher. The statue remained in the garden, but the community's relationship with it gradually returned to its original function as a simple memorial rather than an object of worship. The monks continued to appreciate the memory of their feline teacher, while recognizing that the living embodiment of Kuro's teaching could only be found in their own moment-to-moment practice of mindfulness and compassion. This experience became one of the monastery's most important teachings about the nature of spiritual practice and the constant vigilance required to avoid the subtle attachments that could arise even in the context of sincere religious seeking. The story of Kuro and its aftermath served as a permanent reminder that true wisdom could not be captured in external forms, but had to be continuously rediscovered through direct experience and authentic practice. The time-traveling teacup master Sato had conducted tea ceremonies for over 30 years in his modest dwelling beside the mountain stream, where the sound of flowing water provided a constant backdrop to the ancient ritual of preparing and serving tea. His collection of tea implements was neither extensive nor particularly valuable, consisting of simple utensils that had been passed down through generations of tea practitioners who understood that the essence of the ceremony lay not in expensive objects, but in the quality of attention brought to each moment of preparation and service. Among these humble implements was a teacup that had belonged to Sato's teacher and his teacher's teacher, before that its origins lost in the accumulated decades of daily use. The cup was unremarkable in appearance, fashioned from local clay, with a glaze that had developed subtle variations and small imperfections over years of handling. Yet, during tea ceremonies, this particular cup seemed to possess qualities that transcended its simple material existence. The first indication of the cup's unusual nature occurred during a ceremony Sato was conducting for a small group of students on a misty autumn morning. As he lifted the cup to demonstrate the proper method of receiving tea, the porcelain seemed to shimmer slightly, as if the glaze was catching light from sources that were not visible in the room. The effect was so subtle that Sato initially attributed it to the changing quality of morning light filtering through the paper screens. Yet, as the ceremony continued, the phenomenon intensified. When Sato placed tea in the cup and began the ritual of whisking, the liquid seemed to swirl with patterns that reflected not just the current movement of the whisk, but also the echoes of countless previous preparations. The matcha foam formed spirals that appeared to contain memories of other ceremonies, other hands that had performed the same movements in different seasons and different years. The students noticed nothing unusual, continuing to follow the prescribed forms of the tea ceremony with appropriate attention and respect. Yet Sato found himself increasingly absorbed by the cup's behavior, which seemed to be demonstrating something profound about the nature of time and the accumulation of ritual practice. Each gesture he made appeared to resonate with similar gestures performed by tea masters across decades and centuries. As the ceremony progressed through its traditional stages, Sato began to experience moments when the present seemed to expand beyond its normal boundaries. While whisking tea in the cup, he would glimpse flashes of his own teacher performing the same movements in the same room 20 years earlier. The vision was not imaginary, but felt completely real, as if past and present were occupying the same space simultaneously. When he lifted the cup to present it to the first student, Sato saw his hands transforming momentarily into the weathered hands of his teacher's teacher, a man he had never met, but whose presence seemed to flow through the cup's clay walls. The cup itself appeared to be the same object existing across multiple time periods, connecting the current ceremony to an unbroken chain of similar moments, stretching backward through generations. The student who received the cup showed no awareness of these temporal fluctuations, drinking the tea with proper appreciation and returning the cup with appropriate gratitude. Yet, when the cup came back into Sato's hands, the time shifts intensified rather than diminished. He began to see not just past ceremonies, but glimpses of future moments when this same cup would be used by students who had not yet been born. In one flash of expanded awareness, Sato saw himself as an elderly man, his movements slower, but his attention even more refined, presenting tea in this same cup to a young woman whose face radiated the same eager sincerity he recognized in his current students. The room was the same, yet somehow different, with subtle changes that suggested the passage of many years. The ceremony proceeded with identical forms, yet the quality of presence had deepened through decades of accumulated practice. Another temporal shift revealed the cup in the hands of someone Sato did not recognize, a tea master from an earlier era whose clothing and manner suggested a time before his own teacher's generation. This unknown practitioner moved with extraordinary grace and precision, each gesture emerging from profound understanding of the ceremony's spiritual dimensions. The cup seemed perfectly at home in these ancient hands, as if it remembered being shaped by fingers that had long since returned to dust. The visions were not limited to formal tea ceremonies, but included quieter moments when the cup was used for solitary practice or informal sharing between teacher and student. Sato witnessed conversations that had occurred decades ago in the same space, where profound teachings were transmitted not through elaborate explanations, but through the simple act of sharing tea prepared with complete attention and reverence. He saw his own teacher as a young man struggling with the same questions about presence and awareness that Sato's current students asked. The cup had been present during that earlier seeker's breakthrough moments when intellectual understanding transformed into direct experience of the unity underlying all phenomena. The same cup had held tea during countless small enlightenments and gradual deepenings of wisdom. Yet the temporal experiences were not nostalgic journeys into a romanticized past, but direct encounters with the living continuity of practice. Each previous ceremony was as immediate and present as the current moment, suggesting that time was not the linear progression it appeared to be, but rather a multi-dimensional reality where all moments existed simultaneously. The cup seemed to be demonstrating that the present ceremony was not separate from past and future ceremonies, but was the same ceremony appearing in different temporal contexts. As Sato continued to conduct tea ceremonies over the following months, his relationship with the temporal cup deepened into genuine understanding rather than mere fascination with unusual phenomena. He began to recognize that the cup's time-traveling qualities were not supernatural abilities, but expressions of the fundamental nature of reality itself. All objects, all moments, all experiences existed in this same multi-dimensional present. Though most people's attention was too narrow to perceive the full scope of simultaneous existence, the tea ceremony became a practice of expanding awareness to encompass this larger reality. Each time Sato prepared tea, he did so with consciousness of all the tea masters who were simultaneously performing the same actions across time. Each gesture was both his own and the collective gesture of all practitioners past and future who shared in the same essential activity of mindful preparation and respectful service. His students began to notice changes in the quality of Sato's teaching, though they could not identify the specific source of the transformation. His movements during ceremony possessed a timeless quality that seemed to emerge from depths of experience far beyond his individual biography. His instructions carried authority that came not just from years of personal practice, but from connection to the accumulated wisdom of all who had walked the same path. The cup continued to demonstrate its temporal nature, but Sato no longer experienced this as unusual or mysterious. Instead, he understood it as the natural behavior of all phenomena when perceived with sufficiently expanded awareness. The cup was teaching about the nature of existence itself, showing how every moment contained all moments, how every action was simultaneously individual and universal. During ceremonies conducted for more advanced students, Sato would occasionally mention the cup's special qualities, though he was careful not to create fascination with extraordinary phenomena that might distract from the essential teachings about presence and awareness. He explained that the cup's time-traveling abilities were available to anyone who developed the capacity to perceive beyond the conventional limitations of sequential time. Some students reported beginning to experience similar temporal expansions during their own practice, glimpsing moments when their individual ceremony seemed to merge with the collective ceremony of all practitioners. These experiences were not encouraged or discouraged, but simply acknowledged as natural developments that could arise when attention became sufficiently refined and stable. The seasonal cycles that governed life around the mountain dwelling began to take on new significance as Sato's understanding of time deepened through his relationship with the cup. Spring's arrival was not just the current year's spring, but the eternal return of spring energy that had manifested countless times and would continue manifesting endlessly. The cup had witnessed all these springs, holding tea prepared from the same mountain water that flowed with seasonal consistency across decades. Summer ceremonies conducted in the heat of afternoon revealed how the cup maintained connection to winter ceremonies performed in the same space, as if temperature and season were surface variations on an underlying continuity that remained constant. The cup seemed equally at home in all weather conditions, its clay form adapting naturally to seasonal changes while maintaining its essential character across all temporal circumstances. Autumn brought ceremonies where the cup's temporal qualities became particularly pronounced, as if the of transition made the boundaries between different time periods more permeable. Students who participated in autumn ceremonies sometimes reported unusual experiences of familiarity as if they had performed the same actions in the same place before, though they could not remember when or how this could have occurred. Winter ceremonies revealed the cup's capacity to maintain warmth that seemed to derive from more than just the temperature of the tea it contained. The porcelain would remain comfortably warm long after the tea had cooled, as if it were drawing heat from all the warm beverages it had ever held across its existence. Students would comment on how pleasant it was to hold the cup during cold months, not realizing they were experiencing accumulated warmth from decades of use. Years passed, and Sato's reputation as a tea master grew throughout the region, though he never spoke publicly about the cup's unusual properties. Visitors who came for ceremonies sometimes left with subtle impressions of having participated in something that transcended ordinary experience, yet they rarely could articulate exactly what had seemed different or special about the occasion. The cup's influence extended beyond formal ceremonies into Sato's daily life and understanding. Morning tea prepared for his solitary enjoyment became communion with all the solitary practitioners who had ever used the same cup for private reflection and renewal. Evening tea shared with close friends connected to the countless informal gatherings where the cup had facilitated intimate conversation and mutual understanding. Even when the cup sat unused on its shelf, Sato was aware of its temporal presence, encompassing past periods of rest and future moments of service. The cup seemed to exist in a state of constant readiness, equally present to all the moments when it would be called into use for ceremony or simple refreshment. This quality of timeless availability became a model for Sato's own approach to teaching and daily life. Through decades of interaction with the temporal cup, Sato developed profound appreciation for the way present moments contained infinite depth and connection to all other moments. The cup had served as his primary teacher in understanding the non-linear nature of time and the way conscious attention could expand to encompass realities normally hidden by the mind's tendency to focus narrowly on sequential experience. The tea ceremony tradition that Sato maintained and transmitted to his students was enriched by these insights into the nature of time and presence, though the essential forms and principles remained unchanged from those passed down through generations of practitioners. The cup continued to serve as a bridge between past and future, demonstrating through its simple presence that the eternal now was not a philosophical concept, but a living reality, accessible through refined attention and genuine reverence for the sacred dimension of ordinary experience.